Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how a trauma is created. Alright, so before I get going with the video, I just want to give a quick at-a-glance definition of what a trauma is. Of course, the entire video is about trauma, and so we're going to be going much more in depth about it. But basically what a trauma is when we experience something that causes us to feel a really intense emotion to the point where it actually causes us to shut down because we can't process that emotion properly. So I think it's really important to understand exactly how a trauma works, and that's exactly why I'm making this video. Because oftentimes, when we experience a trauma, so many things get mixed together at once, so many thoughts, so many emotions, that it becomes very difficult for us to sort out. And so the trauma seems like a really complex thing, and we're not really sure how to approach it or to resolve it. But if we can start to sort of boil it down to its most basic elements and to see how it comes about, then we can address it a lot more effectively. So it's kind of like the idea of if you have a phone book, it's really easy to rip a page out of the phone book, but if you took the whole phone book and you tried to rip it at once, that would be nearly impossible. So just knowing how a trauma works and all of the various components sort of helps us come at trauma in a more gradual way and a more effective way. Alright, so before I go on any further, I want to clear up some common misconceptions about trauma. Alright, so the first one is the idea that trauma is something that happens externally. So this is a common misconception simply because most all traumas come from the outside originally. So the catalyst for the trauma is external. So some negative situation happens to us, or maybe we don't have a particular need met. And because we relate our trauma so much to that event because it was the catalyst for it, we oftentimes miss the fact that the trauma doesn't really occur externally. It's not about resolving things externally. It's actually a wholly internal thing that's fully self-contained within our mind-body system. So if you've seen my video on systems thinking, basically what a system is basically a bunch of parts that connect together in particular ways to form a whole that produces certain behaviors. And so if a system produces a particular behavior, that means that that behavior was already latent within the system, even if something from the outside catalyzed it. So for example, if I have a long line of dominoes and I come along and I flick the first one and then they all topple over, you could say that me flicking it actually catalyzed the event, but that all of the dominoes toppling never happened with outside of the system of dominoes that was set up. So in a sense, the dominoes are a closed system, just as our mind-body complex is a closed system as well. And so trauma works in a similar way. So essentially, the trauma that happened, or the catalyst for the trauma that happens, is not inside the system. And none of the trauma that occurs within the system happens outside of the system, even though there's a relationship between the two. And so making the distinction between the external event and then the internal happenings that actually create the trauma is really important in being able to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of what creates a trauma and what does not. Now this aspect of trauma can be a little bit difficult to understand, and I noticed that in my video on how to heal from trauma, I would occasionally get people that misunderstood and said, oh, well, so is it my fault that the trauma happened, or this or that or the other, or no, I'm pretty sure that the external event did cause it. And it's like, well, yes, the external event did have something to do with it, and no, it wasn't your fault that that happened. But see, our body and mind react in predictable ways to when we experience certain events externally. And so you could say that the external event is not part of the system, but it certainly has had influence on the system. But if we can sort of separate those two out, we can better understand how a trauma actually happens, and also to understand that because the trauma is fully self-contained in our mind-body complex, it is fully in our field to be able to do what we want with it and to be able to resolve it. So it doesn't have anything to do with external factors, and we don't have to get anything out here a particular way other than maybe removing ourselves from a situation that's negative. But ultimately, all of the healing is going to happen within yourself, and it's fully in your power to do so. Another common misconception is that it's something that happens wholly psychologically, so only in the mind. And so we have a tendency to not realize that the body plays quite a significant role in the creation of the trauma in the first place. So if we think about what a trauma is, it has a lot to do with emotions. And one huge facet of emotions is that they occur within the body. And so if we are missing the body aspect of the trauma, what we'll try to do is we're going to be trying to maybe think our way out of the trauma, trying to bust through limiting beliefs, which will be helpful, but we ultimately won't be focusing on where the trauma is really actually occurring, which is within the body. And this is what makes those emotions come up in inopportune times and, makes it so difficult for us to get through life and causes the mind to react in particular ways anyway. And so it becomes really, really important to be able to respond to the physiological aspect of the trauma as well. All right, so now that I've gone over those couple of misconceptions, I want to go into how a trauma actually occurs and, really what are the building blocks of the trauma. And so if we sort of boil reality down to its simplest form, or our perceptions of reality down to their simplest form, essentially we experience things through 6 different channels of experience. So we have thought plus the 5 senses. So thought, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, or feeling. And so if we think about what a trauma is, because it's a really big emotion, emotion essentially happens on the level of thought and on the level of feeling or touch sensations. Now, when people don't realize this about trauma, trauma can seem like a really, really complex thing because when the content of our thoughts and the content of our emotions mix together, it becomes this really, really complex thing, exponentially more complex than each of those individually. And so trauma feels like it's just way too big and way too complex to even handle, and it becomes awkward even to deal with because you don't even know how to approach it. But if we can separate our sense of reality around the trauma into 2 different channels, we can notice that, we have some thoughts occurring over here and we have some feelings arising in the body. So it really comes down to that idea that, again, to rip one page out of the phone book is very easy, but to try to rip the whole phone book at once is very difficult. So the idea is to very gently and very gradually be able to sort of focus on one element of the trauma at a time. All right, so the most common way that people in society today think about trauma is that, there was some external situation that happened that was negative, and then the trauma was there. So they miss the middle ground. There are a couple of steps in between that happen very, very quickly and might actually kind of get lost in the ether of the experience as it goes on. But there are some very clear steps in between when the catalyst for the trauma happens and the actual trauma occurs. And then there are some things that happen afterward as well. All right, so right now I'm going to tell you exactly the steps that trauma occurs through, and I'm going to go ahead and post those up on the screen so that you can see them really clearly. And if you want to take notes on it, that might be a good idea, or take a screenshot so you can go back and look at it if you're someone who's really interested in resolving trauma. All right, so here are the steps to what happens during trauma creation. So the first thing is that there's an external situation that happens. So basically something or another happens, and it's usually something that's like really clearly negative, but it might not necessarily be super clear that it's negative. So something that is traumatic to one person could be completely not traumatic to another, and vice versa. So that's when the second step comes into play. So the second step to trauma creation is that thoughts occur relative to the situation that just happened and what it means. So a lot of it has to do with the meaning that our mind places on top of what happened. Now, sometimes this may not be the case because we do have particular needs. So we have needs for safety and we have needs for security. We have, let's say, needs for food, things like this. So we're not going to be able to get away from that. So if we have that directly, taken from us or, directly breached, then the mind will naturally interpret that negatively because it it is a threat to our survival and a threat to our well-being. But sometimes something that's not necessarily a threat to our survival or well-being will happen, and then we'll also experience a trauma just because of the meaning that our mind makes from it, because the second step is when those thoughts come up. All right, the third step is that in relation to those thoughts that occur, feelings start to arise in the body in response to the thoughts. What happens is those feelings are too intense for the central nervous system to handle. So because emotions come up in the central nervous system, we can only really handle so much. And so when an emotion comes up, or maybe a series of emotions come up together that are just too much for the central nervous system to process, essentially what happens is next that the trauma comes up. So this is the next step. So there's a cold burn internally, and this is the trauma. So if you've ever experienced a trauma, you may be familiar with the sensation that I'm talking about. And to me, this feels a lot like ice being just in that area wherever the trauma is arising within. So oftentimes when I've experienced trauma in the past, it's usually happened in the chest and in the stomach, and there's always this kind of sinking feeling, and it's, like I said, it's like a cold burn. All right, so the fifth step is that our mind and body shuts down the processing of that emotion, and it helps protect us from being overwhelmed emotionally, so it makes us unconscious to protect us. So whenever we repress a feeling away or repress things related to trauma, essentially what this is the mind and body complex, and it's sort of like emergency protection mechanism. So it's done for a positive reason, even if it leads to some undesirable things in the future. It just doesn't want you to experience so much of that intense emotion head on that it causes even more damage. So it shuts down the process. In fact, some people even faint whenever they go unconscious. So that's what that's for. It's to protect the mind and protect the body from those intense emotions. And then the sixth step is that the unprocessed emotions remain in the central nervous system, unconscious to us, unless they're triggered again by similar thoughts that made the original trauma occur within the system. So for example, let's say that we experience some kind of physical abuse, maybe somebody, an uncle of ours was hitting us or something like that. And there were certain thought processes or certain situations that were related back to that trauma. And whenever you might venture there in the future, like with your mind, experiencing those same emotions or experiencing some similar situation, those feelings can get triggered back up into your conscious mind. That's what triggering is when you have something going on underneath the surface that you've maybe become unconscious to, and then suddenly something happens, or someone says something, or something or another happens, where suddenly now you're in the brunt of that intense emotion again because it's been triggered up and it's come up to the conscious level. So as you might be able to tell already, knowing this process becomes a lot easier to deal with trauma, just knowing how it comes about, because even in seeing these basic steps of how it's created, we might even start to get some intuitive ideas about how to address it properly. Now, very shortly, I'm going to go into the process for how to actually resolve those emotions that have remained in the central nervous system, and how to process through those old emotions and those traumas. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what I call emotional wattage. All right, so to explain a bit about what I mean by emotional wattage, we want to think about where emotions actually occur in the body. So if we know where the emotions occur, we know that they occur in the central nervous system. And in the central nervous system, the way that we feel emotions is that there's some kind of electrical impulse going on in the system. So if we think about our central nervous system as, like, let's say a giant light bulb, we know that light bulbs can only experience a certain amount of wattage before they blow out, and that's why the light bulbs have a number. So if you have a 50-watt light bulb, you're not going to be able to pump 100 watts of electricity in there without that light bulb blowing out. And so it's the same kind of situation. We have a certain degree of emotional wattage that we can handle in our central nervous system. But if we have too much emotion going on, and maybe a mixture of different emotions that are maybe very confusing to us, we are at the risk of sort of blowing out in and of ourselves. But we're not flimsy like a light bulb. We're built to be very, very resilient. And so our body and mind complex has a lot of great coping mechanisms and a lot of great protection mechanisms to keep us from blowing out and really causing a lot of damage to our central nervous system. So that's why the unconsciousness happens, and that's why the repression happens. But essentially, if we think about our central nervous system as like a light bulb that only has a certain degree of emotional wattage that it can handle, whenever a trauma happens, that is the same thing as being like a 50-watt light bulb, and then all of a sudden here comes 100 watts of electricity, and we essentially don't know how to process it. We don't know how to sort of move past it. Now, this is especially true when we're children, because essentially children don't have the physical development yet to have a higher degree of emotional wattage like an adult has. So let's say if an adult has a 50-watt light bulb, let's say, a child would have a 10, 15, 20-watt light bulb depending on where they are in their development. And so this is why oftentimes childhood is like the most vulnerable time, and where we're experiencing the most trauma that we ever experience in life, because things hit us so much more as children. Like when we experience joy, we experience lots of joy. When we experience sadness, we experience lots of sadness. And it's simply because it's very easy for those emotional impulses to sort of out-tax us. And so it is a very vulnerable time, and that's why those traumas come up so much at a young age. But all the same, whether we're adults or whether we're children, we are built for resilience. It's very, very hard for us to blow out because our system is so complex and so much designed for us to bounce back from trauma. If you think about it, it's nearly impossible to get through life without some degree of trauma happening. I don't think it is even possible. And so we have all of the ability to heal from that trauma right here within us. And in fact, it is the natural impulse of ourself to try to move through that. And it's only the things that really stand in the way of resolving that trauma and resolving those sort of stagnant emotions that are staying in the central nervous system that really keep us from healing. Also, another thing about emotional wattage, let's say that we're in a situation where we have experienced trauma constantly. Like, let's say that you're a child and you grew up in an abusive family where you're abused daily. What will happen then is that essentially your mind-body complex knows this and will prime you for it. And so it'll sort of repress away all of those feelings, and it'll repress away all of the thought processes so that you can get by in life as normally as possible. Now there are some problems here, and this is why, people in those types of situations tend to feel numb or tend to feel disconnected in some way, because that's the protection mechanism that their mind and body has created to keep them from that situation. And it gets you by in those moments, and it gets you by while you're in that situation. But once you're out of it, then it reaches a point of diminishing returns, and it becomes a problem, because then you have all of these different coping mechanisms that don't serve you in other ways. So I don't think it's often understood or mentioned that repression and unconsciousness is actually serving a practical purpose for us in these situations. But regardless of how positive it is for those situations and helping us maintain that resilience and being able to come through those situations, of course they cause many problems in the aftermath, because what we have are a bunch of coping mechanisms and a bunch of protection mechanisms in place. And oftentimes they work at cross purposes to one another, and of course they're not ideal. And so we end up with a lot of maladaptive coping mechanisms, and we end up with a lot of sort of neuroses and complexes that keep us from really enjoying life, because we're so focused on not experiencing the situation that caused the trauma in the first place and hiding away from those emotions that are too overwhelming for us if we were to face them head on all at once. So even though traumas are 100% designed to heal, and actually once you heal from them and they don't hurt anymore, you can actually derive a great deal of wisdom from them. So even though that's the case, that they're designed to heal, it becomes very difficult if we can't process the emotions that we originally shut down when we were trying to protect ourselves from experiencing more trauma. And unfortunately, most people don't really know how to process through those emotions that surround that trauma. So the trauma itself can never really heal, that cold burn that happened, but also the emotions around it just kind of keep the whole thing going. And so because most people don't know how to process them, they tend to suffer with it for their entire lives. And this becomes a problem because they get themselves into particular situations and they have to move through life, and they end up in situations where, their fears get triggered around experiencing those emotions again, or the emotions themselves get triggered and it becomes overwhelming, or, it's just an all-around nuisance and an unconsciousness that it causes, creates a lot of negative results in life. And so it is very unfortunate that people don't really know how trauma works. And this is specifically why I made this video, because I think it's really, really important for people to understand this whole process. All right, so here is how you process through the emotions that surround a trauma, that are stuck in the central nervous system. So what you want to do is you want to go to a place where you feel very, very comfortable, maybe your room or just a designated place, or if you have a meditation practice, go to wherever you meditate. And then essentially what you're going to do is you're either going to sit in a meditative pose if that's comfortable for you. You can also lay down if you want to, but you want to make sure that you don't prime yourself for falling asleep, because one of the tricks that our mind might use to help us avoid these emotions is actually making us think that we're tired and that we need a nap, or trying to distract us in some way. But we want to actually commit to sitting there or laying there or doing whatever we need to do to actually sit still. Then what you want to do is you want to actually gently put yourself in the mind space of whenever you experienced the trauma. So whatever thoughts were coming up or whatever the situation was, and you can use your imagination to sort of recreate it. And you want to be very gentle with yourself with this, because for some people, some traumas are really, really difficult to relive. And you want to always tune in to what your body is telling you when you're doing this, because there's a reason why your mind and your body have shut this out in the first place, because as a whole, the emotion was too big to handle. So when you do this, you want to really pay attention. And if you feel overwhelmed, then you want to take a break and then you want to come back to it. And then what should start to happen is that those negative emotions, those traumatic emotions, should start to rise up in the body. And then what you want to do is you want to detach yourself from the mental thought process that you use to sort of bring up those emotions and trigger up those emotions into your conscious awareness. And you want to put your focus directly on the sensations in the body. So one of the reasons why these are difficult to process through is because we don't often focus on our body. We don't really actually put our attention on it. And so we often have mindsets and different processes that we're doing unconsciously to keep us from becoming aware and from processing through those emotions. So you want to put your awareness directly on those sensations. And so when it becomes aware to you, essentially that's what's happening there is an integration into your conscious awareness. And that's what actually helps it process. So remember, it's been shut out of your conscious awareness because your mind and body have tried to protect you from it. And now what you're doing is you're trying to slowly and gradually reintegrate it back into your conscious awareness. And it's in this process, a very, very simple process through becoming more aware, that you can start to resolve some of those emotions. And then with resolving some of those emotions, many of the mindsets will naturally fall away, and many of the maladaptive coping mechanisms will become obsolete, and many of the neuroses and the complexes that are created to cope with the situation will also become obsolete. And so this isn't something that'll happen right away. It's not going to probably take just one sitting. What you'll have to do is you'll have to do this over the course of maybe months, maybe years. Maybe it won't be that long. Maybe for some smaller traumas it'll be the course of days. But it'll make all the difference, because essentially this is how you integrate things into your conscious awareness, is by actually focusing your awareness on things. And of course, if you want to see more about trauma on my channel, and I have a little bit about this process actually on this video as well, there's a video called How to Heal from Trauma. I did it, I think, about 1.5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and you can check that out. And I have more information about trauma on there as well if you want to understand more. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below and subscribe. Also, I wanted to say thank you so much to my patrons. You guys really help me stay motivated to create new videos every week. And I also wanted to mention one thing that I'm offering through my Patreon right now if you want to check this out. So last month I opened up 15 slots for anybody who was interested in becoming one of my coaching clients. So basically what I'm doing now is I'm sort of dabbling in life coaching to see if it's something that I'm interested in doing. And then if I am interested over the course of months and I think it's the right fit for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enroll in a life coaching program. And so far I've had 8 sessions and it's just been absolutely wonderful, and I've had such a great time talking to my clients. And so if you're interested in having a life coaching session with me once per month or twice per month, you can go to my Patreon page and you can check out the details, and if you're interested you can sign up. And so I just wanted to mention that for anyone that was interested, because I just opened up 15 more spots for the 1 hour session, and then I also opened up more slots for the 2 hours per month, so 2 sessions. Alright, so if you're interested in that, check that out. And other than that, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and until next time, keep becoming more you.